Hi, welcome those that are coming in. While we're waiting to get started in just a minute, if you want to drop in the chat your name and maybe your role or what school district you work with, it'd be nice to meet you. It just comes to panelists, so we can see some of you. Welcome those that are joining. Hey. Well, we are at our start time, so I'm going to go ahead and dive in and want to respect your time today. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to join us and talk about how we can meet the needs of students with dyslexia, and talking a little bit about the reading brain as well and how that can inform our instruction. My name is Chantel Blake. I am the Vice President of Education and Outreach at Reading Horizons. My passion is reading science and dyslexia, and I'll share a little bit about my story, but I just want to welcome you again. Thank you for being here. You saw a little bit about what the intended content is today. Feel free to drop in questions. We'll leave some time for Q&A after if there's anything you would like to know more about. But in line with what our focus is, some target outcomes is first to understand a little bit about dyslexia and the reading brain. There's probably varying levels of knowledge and familiarity with dyslexia, so we'll just kind of level set on a few things, and then understand more of those difficulties and risk factors identified with dyslexia. I want to introduce and become familiar with the risk and resilience model, which really helps us view the whole child and what they're bringing and how we can best support them and mitigate some of those risks specifically, and provide some strategies that we can implement right away in our instruction to better meet the needs of these students with dyslexia. So my story, I actually was an English teacher right out of my undergrad. I taught at a lockdown facility. Actually, I'm from Utah, so I'm actually from Burley, Idaho. So a lot of you here from Idaho, Colorado, but I grew up in Burley, Idaho, came down to Utah for school, and then out of my undergrad taught at a lockdown facility. And I was ready to teach the finer points of the 5-paragraph essay and all these higher level comprehension skills, and I was not prepared for what I walked into, that the majority of my students were very struggling readers and couldn't access the content that I was supposed to be teaching them. And that was my first pain point in recognizing I really had no idea how to help them. I didn't understand the reading process, how it was developed. And so when it broke down, I just tried to give more vocabulary instruction and comprehension instruction, and I was missing some key understandings there. Where that door to that understanding came in is more on a personal note. So I have 3 children. They're all actually adults now. I share this picture of them at this age because this is when we were able to identify some challenges that my son, my only boy, Tyler, had. So I loved reading. I read to him at night. We did story time at the library. My oldest, Amanda, came out reading really well and just being really successful early on. Tyler, very different results, even with the same approach. And it was weighing heavily on me because I didn't understand what was happening. I knew what I'd done and what preschool had done, and he was struggling. And it was weighing heavily on me as a mom. That mom guilt was bad enough, and then I had educator guilt. I'm a teacher, I may not know what's happening with him. And happened to have a moment of grace during that time. I was at the doctor's office, the pediatrician's, with one of my kids, and was in the waiting room and pulled a magazine off of the shelf. And it fell open to an article symptomatic of struggling readers. And every point I went, oh my gosh, this is Tyler. This is Tyler. And it was an excerpt from Dr. Sally Shaywood's book, Overcoming Dyslexia, which I knew nothing about at the time. So I drove from the doctor's office to Barnes & Noble and bought the book and devoured it. And this is my first exposure to understanding how the brain learns to read, what the differences are between a proficient and struggling reader and those with dyslexia, and what they need. And that started my journey and my connection to Reading Horizons. It's been a long journey and one of challenges, but one I'm so grateful for, because I had worked with them enough. He didn't qualify for services at school other than speech. So that became my responsibility. And that's what led to my direction and my master's in reading science and dyslexia, and pursuing my doctorate now as well. And this has been a fun journey to see his growth. He's an app developer for DoorDash in San Francisco. He and his wife lived there. My youngest daughter was also diagnosed later, but she was a compensator. It showed up much later for her. So I appreciate all you being here, because as a mother of 2 children with dyslexia, the effort of us as teachers to understand and better meet their needs is meaningful and important work. So let's just make sure we're aligned on what dyslexia is. This is the official long definition from International Dyslexia Association. You're probably familiar with this. Just highlighting a couple of things. It is neurobiological in origin. We do see some brain differences at birth. And so there is that heredity that we can see. So a lot of times family members, we see that with about high percentage of that. If they've got dyslexia, then a child can, it's about 50% if one of the parents do. And it's really specific in the reading process, with a difficulty with accurate and fluent word recognition, poor spelling, and decoding abilities. There's some secondary results, but that's the primary difficulty. So we see it as these warning signs, right? With difficulty being able to learn those sounds and the letters that represent those sounds. So problems with early decoding in children, slow in labor, it's intensive. I saw a lot of this with Tyler early on. My youngest didn't show a lot of this, but I saw these warning signs of her as she got into those teenage years, where that content became so much. We started to see more of that slow and labor reading. She was really tired. It was showing up in her spelling, mispronunciations. So there's resources that we'll share with you after as well, to kind of help look for those warning signs in those students. But this is something that it's not just one causal factor, and it's kind of on a varying spectrum of how it manifests in students, what we're going to see, and the severity of their difficulties with the word reading and with executive functioning and working memory that we'll talk a little bit about. But to really understand what it's like for those students, and I want you to think about those students you work with and see if this resonates with you. And I'd love to, you can share it in the chat. But when Tyler was 17, our film crew brought him in and wanted to just film him about what it's like to have dyslexia and some advice he'd give. I, as his mother, had no idea what he was going to say, but he came up with some really cool analogies that I think will resonate with you and the students that you serve. And it's really good to hear what it's actually like from a student who has dyslexia.
Dyslexia, what it is to me is that I just have a hard time reading and writing, and then trying to take notes and understand and process what my teachers say. Like sometimes I have a hard time saying it, so sometimes they think it's like made up or something. And so they think I just make an excuse for not being good at English or like writing, just my writing's really bad, or my just reading and grammar and stuff. And they think I just make up an excuse, and it's not an excuse, and it's really something wrong with me. Sometimes when we're taking notes in class, it feels like we're like out catching butterflies, and it takes me forever to catch one butterfly, and then the whole other class have caught like 3 butterflies, and I have to hurry up and catch up and take my time to catch 2 other butterflies, and it's just hard because it took me forever to get the first one. And like when colleges look at my grades, I always feel bad, like I'm not gonna get into a good college because of my grade in English, no matter how hard I try. I try to bring it up, but it's so hard to do it, and most teachers don't help me try to bring it up. I just get made fun of a lot because of it, because most people think it's just that I'm like stupid or something, but I'm not, and I just have a hard time with it. I just struggle in it.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on his analogy about the butterflies. That was pretty profound, that he always felt behind, that he had to catch up, and that processing speed was a challenge for him, and feeling not smart. And that we do know from the research that it has nothing to do with intelligence. And that's a key thing that we make sure our students understand. Why we want to understand and talk a little bit about the reading brain and how to support these students with our instruction is because of the prevalence. It's roughly 10 to 20% of the population, and it represents 80 to 90% of those with learning disabilities. So when we're in special education and in intervention, this is the majority of the population of the students that we're serving, that this is where their difficulty is in relation to reading. So understanding a little bit about the reading brain is important for us. Essentially, We're rewiring the brain for all of our students, but this is vital for our students with dyslexia. I mentioned in my story that kind of my first exposure to learning about the reading brain came from reading Overcoming Dyslexia, which is a foundational piece of work. If you haven't read, it's so, so valuable. And to understand this key fact, reading is a human construct. It's less than 6,000 years old. It's not something our brains are wired to do. So the reading brain is taught. It's not born. It's not something that students will pick up like they do speech as a baby just by being exposed to it. That's a misconception. It is something that has to be taught because these pathways in the brain have to be built, because that's not what we're wired to do. So I'm not going to spend long, but I'd like to take a little bit to talk about the reading networks, how we build those through our instruction, and to look at the brains and those reading networks of a proficient reader and a struggling reader, what we see in individuals with dyslexia. So to start, let's just make sure we're clear on just some basic terminology. So there's the 4 lobes in the brain, and just being able to kind of think about what these do, it'll make sense how they connect and or get repurposed for the reading process. So the frontal lobe, which is shown in blue, is responsible for higher level processing of thoughts, reasoning, speech, movement, emotions, and problem solving. Now, the parietal lobe, shown in yellow, is responsible for movement, orientation, recognition, and perception. The occipital lobe in red is responsible for visual processing, and the temporal lobe in green is responsible for auditory perception, memory, and speech. Now, reading is a complex process, so many areas of the brain are going to be involved in reading. Now, our brains did not evolve for reading, but they did for speech and oral language. So new pathways, though, because of the reading, have to be created. And areas are repurposed and neurons are recycled to make this process happen. So because we are wired for speech and oral language, the reading networks are built on those. So we want to start by talking a little bit about those language and speech areas of the brain, primarily housed in the left hemisphere. There's 2 main important areas that are also involved in reading. First is Broca's area. It's in that back frontal lobe. So this is responsible for speech production, verbal working memory, grammatical information, and our inner speech. The second area is Wernicke's area, and this area is thought to be responsible for spoken language, planning use of words. It's where we actually map the sounds and even the meaning of words in that area. And there's connections between those two, and they're a critical part of reading comprehension. So they're a big part of this, and the other networks are built and connected to these areas. So this is really important to recognize that these are going to be involved because of that language comprehension. But we know that reading is more than language comprehension, right? We have to have the ability to recognize words and lift them off of the page. We have to take these symbols and connect them to speech. Again, our brain is not wired to do that. And so we have to help build those networks. This is best represented, these 2 main components, in Scarborough's reading rope model, which you've probably seen before, where we can see these 2 main components of language comprehension and word recognition. Also the sub-skills involved in those components and how those work together to get to skilled reading. So that critical part of print is that word recognition. And we know that is where the deficit is for students with dyslexia. It is very specific. There's not an issue usually up here unless they have developmental language disorder or DLD. There's more conversation about that happening and being comorbid or sometimes with dyslexia, but usually it is primarily that word recognition. So even the awareness of sounds, there's a phonological core deficit. So that's really challenging to make that connection, to then go into the decoding and move those to that word recognition. So I want you to think about these 3 main components of word recognition, and we're going to kind of connect that to those reading networks in the brain to get to skilled reading. So we're going to look at the development of these networks and the ones that are most predictive by age for reading proficiency. So the first network that has to be built is called the dorsal network. So think of the dorsal fin, like top of our brain, and we're going from Broca's area to this letter sound area. So the letter sound area is actually known as the decoding center. It's word analysis. It's where we're able to take those, see those letters and sounds and figure out how to decode that and break it apart. And this is most predictive by age 7 for students for skilled readers. So this pathway is connected through that explicit instruction, and it's important that that gets established so that students know how to decode. Now, there's kind of a shift in the reading network at about age 10. So what you can see here, and just look and see what you notice. So if you see that lighter shade, it means it's not quite as activated. So we see actually a decrease in Broca's area. There's no longer kind of an over-reliance, or it's more efficient actually at this point. If that dorsal network has been established, they know how to decode, they're decoding words, they're doing so efficiently so that they can orthographically map those words. And when that happens, that's where they move to the word form area for automatic recognition. And that builds this really critical pathway called the ventral network, which is on the lower part of the left hemisphere. Now, both networks are used in reading at this age. It's just that this network, if it's established, is predictive of reading skill at age 10. So these networks are things that we can help build, and those connections and pathways we can make through our instruction and help students get to build that word form area, because that's where that mapping takes place, and automatic word recognition becomes how they're reading, so that they can go to those language comprehension levels and go to those upper strands of Scarborough's rope. So now, just the last couple of things to look at in the brain. Again, these are very simple images. There's kind of more going on here, but kind of these simple areas just to identify. Let's look at a proficient reader versus a struggling reader. We're going to look at age matched and then reading matched. So age matched first, these students are the same age. This is a proficient reader on the left here. So all of these areas, so Broca's area can also be referred to as the speech sound area. Sometimes that's nice to remember its function. So we see all of those three working, right? They're activated. We're not looking at the pathways, but those connections are there. Now I want you to look at the brain of a struggling reader. Okay, same age. And I just want you to take in and see what you notice. What do you notice that's different? You can share it in the chat if you want, or just think about it. I'm going to highlight a couple of the differences that are there. First, you can see that there's an overactivation in the speech sound area or Broca's area. That's not because of an over-reliance, it's because it's inefficient. And then you can see an underactivation in the letter sound area and the word form area. You can imagine if this is inefficient, this pathway is not well established, they're not decoding accurately, they're not getting enough practice for that to be recognized automatically. So they're not building that word form area. This increase in activation, and this is what we see in the brains of students with dyslexia. And this increased activation in that speech sound area is evidence of that phonological processing deficit. They struggle processing speech sounds and the sequence of speech sounds, which you can imagine why that makes it so challenging to develop that network and get that level of automaticity. It's why it feels like these students, and I still tutor students, there's a few actually in Idaho that I'm tutoring right now, and it's like they need so much more exposure and so much more practice. Now, memory is a factor there, attention is a factor, but it's largely because there's some differences in the brain wiring, but they have to have this instruction to build these networks. It's not going to happen otherwise. Now, some students can start to make those connections and build those networks, but students with dyslexia, it will not happen without explicit instruction. And so there's a silver lining here that we want to look at. Look at this when we actually match the students by reading level. So this is both are reading at a second grade level. This is an actual second grader. And this is an older student reading at a second grade level. What do you notice? Right? They're the same levels of activation. And what's so cool about this is that that means that it's not like dyslexia is not a result of this. It's because they have this inactivity and this lack of experience with reading. And so it's something we can actually do by our instruction, that explicit instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics, and practice decoding with support, and lots of opportunities to see those words, to develop that word recognition. Automaticity is critical. As teachers, you are brain surgeons without actually having to cut into the brain. You are rewiring those brains, building those networks, establishing those connections. It takes longer with students with dyslexia because there are some differences there, but we know, and some will talk about how we can say that it's more of a label, not a result of, that we can actually influence it with the instruction. That's the greatest resilience factor there is for students. So I want to talk a little bit about risk and resilience factors. Hugh Catts and Petscher released this in 2022, and this just resonated so much with me as someone who's seen it up close and personal, and hopefully it will with you too, is recognizing that it is students with dyslexia. It's not an all or nothing proposition. There's not one causal factor. It's kind of this balancing act between these risk factors and these resilience factors to determine the variance that we're going to see and how this manifests in the students that we work with. I just want you to take this in for a minute and see if you recognize some of these risk factors in your students. And if you have more of those, if that shows up more severely in your students, and those that maybe have more resilience factors and how they show up. Now, for time's sake today, I'm not able to go through all of these, but I do want to highlight a couple. I want to start with, because it's such a core issue, is that phonological deficit, and talk about some ways that we can help with that in our instruction. It is very intentional that instruction is the top resilience factor. And with what we just talked about with the brain, you can see why. It is totally dependent upon our instruction to help build these networks in the brains of all students, but particularly for those with dyslexia. So let's talk about how we do that. Let's look at that phonological coding deficit in individuals with dyslexia. That's really 4 components. So phonological awareness, which we're more familiar with, but there's also an issue with phonological memory. Again, that's going to go to the sequencing of those phonemes and being able to even retrieve the sounds and the pronunciation of words. That's challenging. And then sometimes the producing of those sounds. A lot of those students may end up in speech. My son Tyler did as well. We assess that by, phonemic awareness assessments. We can start to make those connections by letter naming and letter sounds early on. So phonological memory and retrieval, those are things we're more going to provide supports for in how we're teaching, but what we're teaching can help be very explicit and ensure the development of that phonological awareness and support in that phonological production. So I want to give a few strategies for that. So phonological awareness is that umbrella term, that overall awareness of sound, starting at the sentence level, all the way down to the syllable level. When we get to the individual phoneme level, that's where we get into phonemic awareness, and that's most highly correlated to reading outcomes. So we want to provide phonemic awareness practice, and we want to align with best practices that have been outlined through the research, which suggests that it should be there's no more positive results beyond 20 hours of instruction per academic year. That breaks down to about 5 minutes in a class period, and it should be no more than 2 tasks at a time. So whether it's identifying initial sound or some blending, we shouldn't be doing identifying initial, identifying final, blending, segmenting. That's too many tasks. So 2 tasks. And if we're talking about biggest bang for our buck, we want to spend time on blending sounds because they have to be able to recognize those and then blend them for decoding, because that's what leads to reading. And then segmenting those for spelling. That's most highly correlated to spelling. So spending our time there is most critical for our students with dyslexia. When we talk about phonological production, the ability to produce those sounds, instruction in a sound spelling wall is incredibly helpful so that they understand how to produce those sounds and then connect it through explicit instruction of the letter or letters that represent those sounds. So as an example, let's say we're going to start teaching the consonant J today. We wouldn't just introduce the letter, we'd start with the sound. The sound is J. Watch my mouth, say it with me, J. Match that. You can use mirrors and help students make that connection. Talk about it as a windy with a stop. It's voiced. You can get to that level. Just talk about that phoneme. It doesn't have to be super deep, but enough that helps them with pronunciation. The keyword jam, and then we introduce that grapheme. And that first grapheme we're going to teach is J. J spells the sound J. Then as we teach other spelling patterns for the sound J, we want to go back to what that sound is, revisit that phoneme, and then uncover and explicitly teach those new graphemes that G followed by E or an I can spell J. So does, these are a little bit later in advance, we know DGE and GY as well. So being explicit and intentional about when we teach those, not all at once, but intentionally connecting it to the sound. Those are some things that we can do to influence and help support that phonological code deficit. As we connect, that alphabetic principle can be challenging, because we have to take that visual input again, the part of our brain that we use for recognizing print was originally for face recognition. We've got to repurpose it. Now these symbols, which many look the same, we have to be able to discern and identify what letters or what sounds they're representing and mapping it on, because written language is representative of our spoken language. So we have to be able to map that. So getting support of teaching the name and sound, being explicit in letter formation. There's a lot of research on that actual doing that formation while they're saying the name and sound to help in that mapping. Other supports can be kinesthetic cues, can be helpful because the vowels, again, remember, it's kind of slow and fuzzy for them if they have that phonological deficit. And so being clear and giving some differentiators that can help will be beneficial for students with dyslexia. And for younger students, maybe embedded letters where the picture that's a cue for that name and sound is embedded can be very helpful as well. So I just want you to take a few seconds and think about, because this is an important takeaway, one of the core deficits, not the only one, but one that's core and a risk for individuals with dyslexia is a phonological deficit. So what is maybe one instructional strategy that we talked about briefly to help address that? If you could add it in the chat, that would be great. One instructional strategy, or think about it and at least write it down, because that will connect to your brain. What is one instructional strategy to help? Okay, so thinking about that, now let's move into some other aspects of that. Oh, good. Here's some coming in. I just needed to give you some time. Good. Don't teach all the tasks in less than one day. Nice. Good, Tricia. Thanks for that. Okay. All right. Yep. And blending on sound, Sean. Good. Okay. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about, so remember there's other risk factors and they can coexist with other difficulties. It's actually very prevalent for individuals with dyslexia to also be diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. That's actually what Tyler was diagnosed with first, that attention issue. Dysgraphia, he also has dysgraphia, so that impacts written expression. You can see it in the way letters floating, changing size, no spacing in their writing, struggles taking notes off of the board. A lot of challenges with dysgraphia really shows up in spelling as well. Dyscalculia, which is tied to numbers. It'll affect their ability in math. Executive functioning, which we'll talk a little bit more about. The ability to plan, organize, memory, reasoning, inhibition. That kid's inhibition still is a challenge at 26 because of some of those executive function challenges, and speech and language. We can see that as well. So again, I don't have time to go into all of these in depth, but I do want to highlight quickly some of this with the attention deficit. So because attention is critical, being able to focus attention on the sound and the letters and what we're doing, and that can be a real challenge there. And so essentially what some have said is that ADHD is an executive function deficit disorder. So executive functions really are like time management, tasks, being able to plan and organize. It's also tied to emotional regulation and motivation. There's actually research out of University of California, San Francisco that is finding that the underactivation in the left hemisphere is also because of the asynchronous nature. There's an overactivation in the right emotional brain. So they're very attuned to emotions around them, very sensitive. And I would say that of my children with dyslexia, but they're also incredibly prone to anxiety and depression because of that. And they struggle regulating those emotions. You've probably seen that in some of your students, and it's something to be aware of. It's something we could do another session on and talk about ways that we can support there. But this is a real thing to be aware of, that they're going to struggle with some of this. So some things that we can do in our instruction, I'm going to talk about explicit instruction briefly as well. Some key things and takeaways that we can do in our classrooms. Post schedules, they need that support. What's the schedule? What are we doing and when? That needs to be consistent, and our routines need to be consistent. They're going to need organization support, and we need to break down big projects. They just don't know where to start. So to give them a huge project, they're not going to be able to do it. Step-by-step instructions, but not just verbal, because of that verbal working memory. That may be a challenge. Maybe give them a visual attention getting phrases, have them repeat orally some of those directions we want them to do, give them outlines, and lots of different options for response. Again, self-management we won't go into here, but just know that they're going to probably need support in regulating their emotions. So I'm going to share again, Tyler, quickly talking about a few things that as teachers we can do to help with that processing time and some of those supports.
What I wish my teachers knew about dyslexia is that I need more time on things and I need more breaks so I can process it, and just to let me, like, instead of having a deadline for everything and like the next day, sometimes I need more time than that to like comprehend what it means and try to understand it fully and then finish it, make sure it's good. Because most of the times I feel rushed by my like homework, and that it's just like I feel like I do a crappy job because I don't have enough time to understand what I did. Because it helps me like to move and to process stuff better, and some teachers get mad at me for moving. It kind of makes me mad because that's how I pay attention and that's how I get stuff done. It keeps my brain like flowing and I can just like process it better. It's like a river. If it's not flowing, it can't really take anything. So if I get it flowing, then it can actually start taking stuff, and then it'll start like making more sense and stuff. The things that have helped me that teachers have done is when I was in 5th grade, I had this teacher named Mr. Zimmerman, and he helped me a lot when it was about essays and stuff. Like, he would give me more time and give me a lot of like corrections and why this was wrong and whatnot, and that helped me out. Something that's helped me is that one of my teachers, when we were in class, we do a PowerPoint and then like we take notes from the PowerPoint. And so sometimes I try to focus, and sometimes I only get a little bit of notes, and she hurries up and goes to the next slide. Sometimes I'll miss like a couple of sentences or something. And she puts the PowerPoints online, so I can always go back and look at them and understand it, and then write it down and like get all the notes I needed.
Okay, so hopefully there's some takeaways there. He needs more time. He needs to be able to move. I loved his analogy there too about like a river. If it's not moving, it can't take anything. And that was kind of a helpful connection for me, that movement sometimes helps those students as well. So let's talk about those resilience factors. So looking at the primary one of instruction, we have decades of research on what is most effective to teach reading. Structured literacy in this graphic was actually first released by International Dyslexia Association in 2014. In 2024, they actually officially released the updated version of this infographic on structured literacy, identifying who should be teaching it, what and how we should be teaching it, and why. Why is because we have the research and we know this is most effective to build those reading networks and help our students reach that level of skilled reading. Teachers, all of us. I mean, this is where we're at, right? Special education, intervention, we should be teaching this. Now, specifically what? Looking at word recognition, which includes handwriting and spelling, comprehension and composition. Now, individuals with dyslexia, this is the primary issue. We want to comprehensively teach both, but this is where we're talking intervention. The focus is likely going to be, and how, that it's explicit, systematic, sequential, multimodal, and I'll highlight a couple of those. So we know what we should be teaching. Think about those areas of the brain that we're connecting. We're connecting those sounds and those letters and the patterns that represent those sounds. We want to do it in a way that supports working memory through that explicit instruction. Sometimes visual cues to help identify and internalize the patterns in words with a marking system is helpful. And those are the things that we do at Reading Horizons to help. So I actually have a colleague, a friend from Idaho, Giselle, if you're there, she's just going to talk a little bit, just for a couple of minutes, about teaching this type of instruction to students in special education. I'll let her introduce herself and share just a little bit about that.
All right, thanks, Chantel. So my name is Giselle Lowe. I am a special education junior high teacher. I've been doing that for 19 years. I teach 7th and 8th graders, primarily with specific learning disabilities and or ADHD. And we've been using Reading Horizons Elevate in our schools for about 10 years is about what we've decided it's been. It's been about 10 years that I've taught using Reading Horizons. So what that looks like at the junior high level is that when the kids come in for their reading intervention class into my room, they start their day with Elevate. We do it for about 20 minutes each class period. For my students who are only 2-3 years behind, they will do it 20 minutes twice a week. For my students who are significantly farther behind than that, 4+ years behind, they'll do it every day for 20 minutes a day. So we do use the software program primarily, and that's been really great at the junior high level because it's allowed for differentiation. I will have within the same class period students who are only 1 or 2 years behind in their reading, students who still cannot identify all their letters and sounds. And so before Reading Horizons, when I would try and teach that whole group, it was very, very challenging. I was rather dragging someone along, or I had students who were super bored. And so Elevate has been nice because it's allowed us to differentiate and meet kids where they're at and work on the skills they need to learn, filling in those holes and gaps and moving at the speed that works for them. I have some kids who'll get in and it just starts clicking and they move very quickly. I have other kids that need more practice and it takes longer for them to move through the lessons. And because of the software individualization, they're able to do that on their own. Some other really good things about Elevate for my students have been that it does not look like an immature reading program. It doesn't look like what they saw in kindergarten or in first grade, which is important in junior high. They don't want to look like they're doing baby work, as some of them will say sometimes. And so that's been really good. It's also allowed us to teach very incrementally the skills and build on success. You know, the kids, by the time they get to junior high, they've been trying to learn to read for years, 7+ years. They've been trying to learn to read and haven't been very successful at it. And so the fact that these lessons are teach in small steps and they're able to get it and understand it and feel some success has been really helpful. So it also has allowed me to learn with my kids. When we first started it, all of the marking and some of the rules even, I learned to read, but it was a long time ago and I don't have to think about those things anymore. So some of that was kind of new and I was having to learn as I went. But that was okay because I was learning as the kids were learning it. And the software did the primary instruction and I would come in and support when kids were struggling and needed extra help, whether in bigger groups with games and review activities or one-on-one, even just sitting down and working with the kids. Some of the success that we've had with teaching in this very systematic way is that I have seen kids have joy in reading who hated books, hated them, would never pick them up, learn to love to read. Sorry, and I didn't ever think I'd get emotional about that, but I'm a reader. I love reading. And so to have kids who go like, oh, I hate books breaks my heart. And so to help them learn to access that is huge. And they've also gained a lot of confidence in my class to where they will start to volunteer to read in my class. And then it trickles out to where they're volunteering to read in their science class, in their history class. And these are things that before we'd written into IEP accommodations that they could not be made to read in class because it was so anxiety inducing. And so to see them make those gains has been really big. I've had kids who started 7th grade reading on a 2nd grade level, who left me as 8th graders reading on grade level. We've had students we've been able to dismiss from needing reading services because they are able to keep up and do what their peers do now. So it just, teaching reading in a way that works for everybody is really, really important. And that's what this does, is it makes it work for all students, including those who have reading disabilities. And so I've really appreciated it. It has worked wonders with my kids, and it's been a great tool.
Thanks, Giselle. And Giselle is someone to talk to if you have questions too about, kind of what this looks. But Giselle, we appreciate your work, and we know you're making such a huge difference just on every level. So thanks for sharing a little bit about that. It's better coming from her than me. So I just want to, as we just kind of wrap up and finish things, I just want to talk a little bit about and make sure we're clear on what we should be teaching is clear and why we should be teaching that to build those reading networks. There is the most effective way of how we should teach it in structured literacy, that it's explicit. And that's very clearly defined, that it's clear explanations, demonstrations, supported practice, feedback. If you have not read the Explicit Instruction book by Archer and Hughes, it was game-changing for me as an educator, even as a presenter and a teacher of teachers. It has changed the way I teach. Just a couple of things to highlight about elements of explicit instruction. And I just want you to take inventory if this is the instruction that you're providing. And think about back to those executive function and those other challenges. We should focus on, and when I get to the bold, I know you're all muted, but I just want you to say it to make this connection. Focus on critical content, sequence skills logically, break down complex skills, right? That goes back to executive function support and memory support. The design should be organized and focused. If you think about some of the challenges there, that's why that instruction has to be very clearly organized from simple to complex. Start with goals and expectations, review those prior skills. They're prerequisite. Do they have that? Can we build on that? Then clearly demonstrate that new skill with clear and concise language, providing guided practice. In that practice and instruction, we want to require and elicit frequent responses from students. The students, who's doing the talking is who's doing the learning. So in a safe space, we want those students verbally responding, monitoring their performance, providing corrective feedback, make sure that pace is brisk if they go too slow. Again, Hannah Gillingham from Orton Gillingham talked about go as fast as you can and as slow as you must, right? So we want to watch that pace, help organize that knowledge, give distributive and cumulative practice, and make sure it's multimodal, that they're hearing it, saying it, writing it, reading it in real time. Three main components of a explicit lesson: an opening, a body, and a closing. An opening is an opportunity to quickly gain students' attention. That's where we state the goal so they know the purpose and identify what's relevant. Why do they need to know this? And then review those prerequisite skills so we can build on that. The body of the lesson, you're going to see that gradual release, the I do, we do, you do. That's a sound instructional model. For students in special education and intervention, we know it's more like I do, we do, we do, we do, you do, you do, or even we do, we do, we do, we do, you do, you do, with lots of scaffolds on the you do, recognizing they're going to need more time to build those pathways. The closing of a lesson should be brief. What did we learn? What are we going to learn next? And make sure that the independent practice we have them do is something that they are now set up to be successful at because we've practiced that together. So explicit instruction in anything we're doing is important, especially for these students, because it becomes a support in memory, executive function, and facilitates learning. We will, in a follow-up email, I've got a little infographic handout for you to just kind of remind you of those key components of an explicit lesson, to just check ourselves, and you can share that with colleagues to make sure we're providing that for students. Last thing to close out, I want to highlight one other resilience characteristic, and that's the growth mindset. It's not something we can necessarily develop in students, but we can help facilitate by talking about mindsets, normalizing struggle. That doesn't mean you're not capable if something takes longer or requires more effort. So we want to encourage that effort, encourage the process, not the person, and harness the power of yet. Yeah, you may not be able to do this yet, but I'm going to give you the right type of instruction and we're going to get there. And part of that, and the research is very clear, is dependent upon our expectations for our students. We need to believe that all are capable of learning and being successful, that they're all expected to improve, and that's going to develop their confidence and motivation. And I would extend this to belief in yourself. I know as a teacher that didn't have this background, I was very overwhelmed. We do it a little bit at a time. Like Giselle shared, you can learn along with these things, and we just keep doing better, right? We do the next right thing. So you need to believe in yourself and believe in your students. And I want to close out with Tyler talking about that belief.
The best thing about dyslexia is that with the 5 senses, when you're missing one, it heightens other ones. So since I'm missing kind of my English kind of section of my brain, it heightens other stuff like science and math. And I do excel in those classes, and I just love those classes. And I just love doing scientific things like inventing stuff, programming stuff. What I would tell someone else with dyslexia is that they're not stupid and they can do it. And you just gotta think of your own way to take in information and stuff. And sometimes maybe my stuff will help them, maybe not. Maybe their stuff will help me, maybe not. But just that they're for sure not stupid. They're actually probably smarter than some kids in some subjects. Everyone's smarter than someone in a different way.
I thought that was pretty great too, that hopefully they know Michelle, this is your fault. You started the emotion part, that they know that they're capable, and that if we provide that instruction, we can help change their trajectory, that we can rewire their brains. So again, I just thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being here, for caring about these students and continually trying to improve our practice and instruction. If you're attending live, we're going to have a little poll pop up. You could just answer yes or no. If you're watching the recording, then you can email us at marketing@readinghorizons.com. Just thank you so much for being here, and hopefully there's some things that you can take away. If you had any aha moments or things that you are going to take away and implement, I'd love for you to share that in the chat. I am really hopeful that there were some valuable pieces for you today that you could share in the chat of what you would like to take away. Here is my email. If you would like to connect with me personally, if there's anything I can do to support you in your work, I would be more than happy to. I'm also on X and share some reading research and support there. I'd like to introduce you to Sean before we leave. Sean is supporting the sales and the support in Idaho, Colorado, Arkansas. So Sean, just want to introduce yourself quickly before we close.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Cool. Well, yeah, I definitely appreciate Chantel taking the time to put this together. I do work Idaho and Colorado and Arkansas, but really just to sort of use my own personal experience, not being an educator or anything. I've found that one of my own kids has had issues just recently. And so being able to use our program as a father and be able to help my own son has been really eye-opening. And so for me, it's just, I love what we do. I love everything Chantel shared about, especially the fact that she can use her own son and that experience. I loved it, but would really love the opportunity to chat with any of you, learn more about our program, just really share more of an overview of what we can do to partner with you and help you out. But really just thanks for joining today. I appreciate it. It's been a lot of hard work getting these invites, getting people here. We appreciate everybody that was able to attend and those that are going to listen to the recording.
Thanks, Sean. All right, everybody. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for all that you do in this important work. And hopefully we'll connect again in the future. Take care.